So this next part is basically chapter number 4, which is it's difficult to say what's the name of chapter 4 because it depends on your topic and your methodology. Like for example, quantitative will talk about findings, but maybe qualitative can talk about case study if they're doing case studies. But it's basically the empirical part. After you talk about your methodology, now you're describing what you actually did. So what is your story from the case, or what are the findings, the numerical findings from your quantitative study? So this chapter, again, you can't write everything because you are not done. So you can start a little bit, at least think on the structure. I will give you a few suggestions in here that maybe you can start thinking on this. And for my perspective, what I want to do when we meet next time to review this submission is that we don't focus that much on the past, but we look forward. Like it's important that you bring some preliminary results, although of course you're still collecting data and all that, but it's nice if you bring some kind of results and we discuss that. So I think that's why it's important, of course, to kind of fix this methodology part from chapter 3, but also to look forward for chapter 4 regarding the empirical part. So now I want to give you a few suggestions. It's kind of difficult because this is very individual or group oriented, depending on what you're doing, method, and all of this, but maybe some general stuff. And let's start with that this chapter is totally based on your data. So it's not necessarily, maybe you can include very few references, 1 or 2 if they're very necessarily, but in reality, you are just reporting. Maybe in quantitative, you need to benchmark your analysis, but I will talk about that in later. But in general, it's very empirical, not many references. And the other suggestion is that the findings can be very complex, and I hope they are complex. So it's important to give them a structure, especially for qualitative. I think you need to have a clear structure. For quant is like an ad hoc structure that we will discuss, but in qualitative, you don't have really like a standard or a benchmark, so you need to construct that structure, and I will talk about that structure in a second. So now I want to focus a little bit on the qualitative methodologies and how someone who's doing qualitative can start working on this empirical chapter 4. So I will say that you can start with an overall of your story. One way is to start with the background of the organization that you are studying, or the 2 or 3 organizations if it is a comparative case study. What are these cases, like very descriptive, what they do, very general. And then after that description, you can talk a little bit and introduce your story, like what is going on in here, like a kind of background that we need from there, like if you're discussing this specific process, very descriptive, how many people are in there, this kind of overall. The first part, the description of the company, can be in here at the very beginning, or it can be also in the methodology when you talk about your sample, but that's up to you. It can be there or here. But my point is that start the chapter with an overview, either the description if you don't have it in the method, or just an overall of your case, what's going on, like the big picture of what's going on. And that can be like the introduction to the empirics. And then exploit the model that you already have. Remember, from the literature review, you end up with a model where you have something and then you have around certain things. I will say that use that model to present your findings. That is one way to do it, that you unpack or you discuss each parts of the model. Like maybe in this model, it's important to talk about investors, and then you talk about investors, and then clients, and then you talk about clients. So you talk about what is important, and these are subsections of your empirical chapter. But that can be complicated if you have more than one case, if you have a comparative case study, because then you can ask me, should I do one subsection for one case and then another subsection for another case, and then I have to do like a comparison later? Or should I discuss in one subsection about investors for both cases? What should I do? The answer is up to you. However you think it will communicate better the story. Maybe if the focus is in the investors, then do it like that. Discuss the different parts of the model, contrasting with the with the two cases. That is one way to do it. It's okay. But if you think that it's better if you tell the whole story for one company and then the whole story for the other company, is still fine. What is important is that in the end, if it is a comparative case study, you have to kind of clash them, like to a comparison, very empirical. So it's complicated, it takes time. That is why I think it's very important that the next time that we have a meeting, you bring some ideas and some preliminary findings of these stories, because we need to discuss all of this, and you also need to discuss in your team. And then now moving to quantitative. In quantitative, I think it's much more structured, it's much more standardized, and you remember from our research methods course. So we always start with presenting the descriptive statistics and correlations at the very beginning. We put them in there, and then, but not only put them, but also explain descriptive statistics, interesting things that come just from descriptives, like the interesting averages, interesting medium maximums, these kind of things. Usually it's like one page. The same for correlations. You kind of show that correlations more or less behave how you expected, also related to the hypothesis, maybe given. Remember, you can't support or reject just with the correlations table, but at least you discuss a little bit like this. This is quite surprising that they don't have correlation, or it is quite surprising that they do have correlation. And then after that, the big part comes when you have your regression analysis. So you have your table, and then you need to explain the important things, if you have multicollinearity or not, the significance and the model fit, and then the significance of the different coefficients, and then you have to reject or support each of your hypotheses. So I think it's very normative how you present your findings in a quantitative studies, that very basic structure, and it's not that long compared to the qualitative. In the qualitative, this is maybe the longest and largest part of your thesis. And quickly going, because this has become like an institution where I show you the rubric. The rubric of the empirical part is shown in two sections. Like one, it talks about collects and uses of empirical material data. And this one is a bit confusing because it's also connected to the data collection part of the method, right? So because it says clearly identifies appropriate material data and explain what is used for. That is kind of explaining the other. So just make sure that when you are writing your empirics, because this is a work for empirics, you connect to what you already discussed in the method. In the method, you talk about the semi-structured interviews and some advantages for semi-structured interviews. So in here, you have to kind of exploit that in the empirics. Like you need to show that semi-structured nature with the evidence that you provide. So you can say that this is during the discussion about this topic, this thing came up, like, I don't know, maybe, I don't know, reporting came up and it was very interesting. And then you include a quote from the interview, like the interview said this. And then you can add a little bit more that highlights that connection to the appropriateness of the data that you collected. So you can link it, for example, to that the person reported was also found in a minute from a meeting, for example. So you have the minute from the meeting where they discussed the topic of reporting, and you have the quote from the interview. And then maybe you can even add another thing, like maybe in the web page, there have something about reporting. So you kind of triangulate this, and it totally links to your methodological choices. So this is kind of an excellent way to show the empirical material that you collect. And the other thing is the big part, like the presentations of the data and the findings. So you have to be critical, rigorous, and convincing on showing your findings. And I think in qualitative, I will say, it's my personal opinion, but I think it's more challenging to do it, because in quantitative numbers, it's like you will fail if you don't discuss, or if you are wrong on the interpretations. But there are numbers, and it's very clear what is in there. So there's no failure unless you don't do it or you do it wrong. But in qual, it's different, because in qual, it's not that clear as is it significant or not. It's more about how you elaborate the argument. So you can say that this evidence from here demonstrate this point, and then this other evidence. So again, you kind of triangulate like the evidence from the interview and the evidence from the documents that you collected, and that contrast another viewpoint, like maybe another person say that, yeah, reporting is important, but it's only because we are forced to do it. So this discussion on the importance of reporting that is relevant, and then you add another kind of another aspect that is also important with evidence, that it is because it's mandatory. So then you add a little bit more on that discussion, and how you construct that is quite difficult. So you have to try. It's not, you won't get it in the first time. I think that in quant you can get it right in the first time, because it's all about reporting. When you analyze the data in the SPSS, that's where maybe you had some you had to do it several times because maybe you failed or something. But once that you get the data, you just put it in there and that's it. But in qual, no, in qual you have to kind of build a narrative of your findings. So it takes time and it's longer. So I think that's more or less what I wanted to show you. From the, if I show you the Word file, I also have kind of something like that, but again, it's very difficult to give examples for everything to everyone, because this is very unique depending on your choices. So don't worry, just for the next meeting, try to bring some kind of preliminary results so that we discuss that, like what is this preliminary data showing us, because that can be very useful. Okay, so see you next time.